Good morning, Team Krulak community, and welcome back to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine war. As always, I'm Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center, and we are, as always, happy to welcome Dr. Yuval Weber, our Russia subject matter expert, to the show. So, as you all described it as we were setting this up, it's been a very newsy week. I kind of last week sitting down, I had maybe one theme in mind, and that was looking at some force structure things emerging inside the Russian military with some administrative stuff from Putin and the Third Army Corps being constituted for possible use, and then things just kept happening. So now we have a lot more to cover than just force structure. So we're going to try and kind of bucket these things into categories as neatly as we can. But there's a lot of developments militarily, a lot of developments in terms of diplomatic and political things, both inside and outside of Russia. And then we also have looking at more domestic things inside Russia, economical as well. So we're going to do our best to get through all of these things here in the next 60 minutes or so. So Yuval, as always, welcome back to the program, and let's just get into it. Or let's start with the military side and what's been going on the ground on both sides of the border.
So first of all, I want to shout out to my dad. It's his birthday today, and so this will be a good test to see if he watches these. So happy birthday, dear Papa. In terms of the military stuff, as you said, we had thought that it was going to be, in essence, talking about Russia first, or Putin signing a decree increasing the size of the military by another 137,000. So let's sort of like have the context for that. In one big picture, the counteroffensive is right now which started its active fighting phase over the last couple of days in and around Kherson city and Kherson Oblast, has been the culmination of stuff that we've been talking about for several weeks. The Ukrainians have been talking about the efforts to retake their land, knock out or push back the Russian invaders, and the reason they probably picked Kherson is that Kherson is on two sides of a river. So the idea being, once they start to talk about taking back this land, they got the Russians to start to reinforce this entire area. Once the Russians put in another seemingly 10-20,000 soldiers in and around Kherson city, the Ukrainians started knocking out all the bridges. So this is part of what we've taken from friend of the Krulak Center, Mick Ryan, Ukraine's strategy of corrosion. So they brought the Russian soldiers in by threatening it. They brought the Russian soldiers on one side of a river. They cut off basically the bridges that resupply those soldiers. And so in effect, they are kettling those soldiers between an impending advance on one side and then a river on the other side. And probably going to try and grind out those forces to create, in essence, something that is really big, not just militarily, taking back your land, reducing the fighting capabilities of your opponents, but also in terms of the morale situation, both in Ukraine, making it more positive, that we're doing well, and on the Russian side, oh no, we're not doing as well as we thought. We thought we were going to annex this land, but the Ukrainians are knocking us out. The bigger picture here is, as we've discussed in a number of recent episodes, there is basically winter's coming. To bring back a show from the seemingly distant past, and one of the big things that the Europeans, just generally speaking, have been very concerned about is when exactly the Russians are going to cut off energy exports to Europe, and that driving up electricity prices, driving up natural gas prices, and obviously making Europe a cold and less economically viable place this winter. So the point of having, victories now is for the Ukrainians to demonstrate basically to the larger Western world, which is supplying them with all the things that they need. Look, we're actually taking the stuff you've given us. We're using it well. Don't essentially lose your own morale. Don't sort of have this idea, the Ukrainians are never going to win. So therefore, why do we keep supplying them? Why don't we just basically cut off the supplies that are existing so that Ukraine and Russia are forced to negotiate? And basically the counteroffensive now is not just for the military tactical issues or the larger operational issues, but in terms of strategy, being able to maintain the status quo, that's a key component of what's going on. So the Ukrainian military has prohibited journalists from going to the front lines. So we don't have at this moment a clear idea of how well the fight is going. Clearly, the stuff that they're releasing is, you know, pictures of bombs, taking out Russian positions. Lots of pictures, which I do believe violates the Geneva Conventions, of the Russian POWs that they're picking up. So we have that. So that, in a certain sense, the counteroffensive it has a military purpose, it has strategic purpose, and obviously last week, President Biden and the Department of Defense announced that another $3.5 billion worth of military equipment is on its way to Ukraine. Not just stuff that they need for the fight now, but stuff that is going to upgrade the military capabilities of Ukraine for a long time. There has been sort of like stuff that we've been seeing is that a new announcement on new military equipment is in fact going to be forthcoming either today. This is September 2nd when we're talking about it, today or in the next couple of days as well. And so that is where, the original issue, the United States and its allies giving military equipment to Ukraine, Ukraine wanting to demonstrate that it's using well, the Russian response. And this is where we thought we were going to start the episode when we were planning this a couple of days ago, is the presidential decree from President Putin in Russia that they are going to increase the size of Russia's armed forces and increase the size of the fighting component of Russia's armed forces. They are also creating an entirely new Third Army Corps, which is interesting, so that clearly they're sustaining like pretty heavy casualties. We don't yet know the exact number, but it's somewhere in the tens of thousands. So they made the decision, and this is something I'd like to get your hot take on. We've been seeing a lot of videos, reports from this new Third Army Corps that clearly they have like really good equipment. The stuff that we see like captured from the Russians is definitely not the most modern stuff, but this new Third Army Corps is getting the modern stuff. And so there's a sort of an interesting issue here. Why is Russia essentially constituting a new corps in the middle of a war instead of creating, smaller units that can be sent into existing corps, existing, military structures, which already have command and control, which already have some, logistical basis. And so that to me is sort of interesting. It suggests perhaps that they don't trust the existing army leadership or military leadership in Ukraine. But why would you? And so we can speculate for a long time. But what did you sort of think about when you saw that they're creating a new corps in the middle of a war, rather than basically putting smaller units into existing larger structures?
Yeah, so definitely, I'd say largely speculation on my part, and I'm just sort of drawing from personal experience and study of history. But when I first saw the Third Armored Corps Constitution, honestly, the first question that popped in my mind was not the equipment, but was the people. Like, where are they getting the people to do this? Because you've noted elsewhere that they're having a really hard time like recruiting people to volunteer to come and join this fight that's not going well. They've maybe done some aspects of a shadow mobilization. I think we've talked about, whether that's expanding the age range of eligible contract soldiers, or just ominous dominus redesignating certain units that were not part of the military to be part of the military. And wow, we added, we took 1,000 irregulars or DNR volunteers, made them part of the military, and we magically increased the size of the military by 1,000. So it's sort of some creative bookkeeping in that aspect. So, maybe we can go back to where are they going to get the people for this, because without doing some other sort of magic bookkeeping or recruiting. But so aside from that, why are they building this up as a separate entity as opposed to plugging stuff in? There could be a few semi-rational military reasons for it. One could be if you build it together and they train together and they do what we would call on our side like pre-deployment workups, before you go to the front, do all of your different training things together. That unit should, and I'm putting more air quotes around that because knowing Russian structure, there's no guarantee this will happen. But in that context, that unit should have better internal cohesion. It should have more streamlined and efficient command relationships because you've built and done everything together. You know who everybody is. You know what to expect from the people above and below you because you've seen it during training. So that gives you can sort of plan on how you're going to use your different components better because you know what they can do because you've seen it. So there are certain advantages to that, to having a separate standalone unit getting itself ready together, and rather than doing onesies and twosies, because the onesies and twosies approach to reinforce that would probably get people to the front more quickly. But then, and this is a sort of a historical thing going back decades, to the World War II U.S. military construct, right? It's sort of notorious, the Repel Depot, they call it, the replacement depot, where like you send your a handful of replacements to a holding area, and then you plug them in 1 and 2 inside the units. That actually turned out to be really not great at all for unit cohesion, because you have these highly inexperienced people coming in, knowing next to nothing about the battlefield, which is they become a danger to themselves and a danger to the more veteran soldiers around them because of their lack of knowledge. You plug them into a group that's been fighting together for weeks or months at a time. That group already has its own cohesion, its own internal dynamics. Now you've got this stranger plopped in your midst. You don't know what they can do. You don't know how capable or incapable they are. You do know that they don't have the survival instincts that you've been building up, painfully over the course of a conflict. And for those reasons and some others, that can actually become a burden in a lot of ways. It can become a tactical burden because you don't know if you can rely on them in an engagement. They're more likely to get wounded, because they don't have those survival skills. And if they get wounded, now they become a burden because you have to evacuate them. You have to take them out of the fight, and then you have to designate people to take them out of the fight, so that reduces your own staffing structure, right? A lot of reasons why, and the internal unit cohesion thing too is people can become resentful of like the new person, right? Until you sort of prove yourself, you don't know. And if you're in combat, you don't have time to sort of like figure out whether this person is capable or not. It's just it injects more friction into a unit that already sort of knows itself, knows its people, and knows how to operate together. So that's kind of a lower reason why you might not do onesies and twosies. The other thing that could be is that they're looking to have a unit that is, how do I put it? Doesn't know what it doesn't know. It doesn't yet know the horrifying bloodletting going on. And if you want to, if you're looking to do your own sort of counter punch, having that as a cohesive unit that is really high, well, relatively high for Russian military, but might have a little bit higher morale. They haven't been sort of damaged and grounded by the brutal reality of combat. You could maybe use them to do a counterpunch somewhere else, and they might have a little more energy to deliver that blow simply because they don't know. They don't know what it's like, and they might throw more bodies at it, and with that sacrifice, maybe you get some more battlefield achievement than you would otherwise. So I say that it could be a coherent reserve that they want to throw en masse at a vital point to see if they can, cause a breakthrough of their own, if you will, with this one massed unit. Again, given what we've seen in terms of Russian cohesion, sort of moral cohesion for their soldiers together, as well as their tactical competence or lack thereof on the battlefield, throwing 10,000 this unit, even if they have the best equipment, it might just be 10,000 more bodies coming back because, as we talked about, I think in the last episode, after 6 months, the structural flaws for them as a non-learning organization haven't changed. So now you have 10,000 fresh bodies, but they may. I personally would not think they're going to perform any better just because they have fresh new stuff off the assembly line than what we've seen before, because the same structural flaws, for an authoritarian military where initiative and questioning and adaptation has been just washed out of them on purpose. 10,000 men gives you mass, but I don't know if it gives you anything much more than that, because the same problems of employment are going to be organic to how they've been trained and organized. So I'll stop there.
No, it's certainly interesting because that, provides a rationale, and it provides something that seems plausible. And so, what we'll try to observe over the next couple, I guess, weeks, because if the Third Army Corps, we've been tracking this for, I guess, the last 6 weeks or so. So, you mentioned in terms of like basically the quality of the recruits coming in. At the beginning of the conflict, the Ukrainians were clear, mass conscription, like they are going, not only are they fighting for their own land, but that everyone is involved, prohibiting men, I think between 18 and 50 from leaving the country. Um, Everyone is going to fight in this, whether they're previously contract soldiers or volunteers, reserve battalions, etc. There's a whole society approach on the Ukrainian side. And on the Russian side, as you were alluding to, we have been observing like actual regions trying to create their own volunteer battalions, own volunteer brigades, which reminded me immediately of the Civil War. When you don't have basically enough recruits at the federal level or through basically the governmental system, you have to basically devolve getting people to lower and lower, geographical units. So, and the other thing that that you mentioned is the age and quality of the people coming in, and this to me is sort of an interesting point to dwell on, because now the age, and seeing pictures of like recruiting posters, is that the Russian military is accepting people up to the age of 58, and so 58 means birth year 1964. So
not an optimal age for an infantryman. just gonna lay that out there. Not optimal.
Because what you're looking for at that point is, if you were born in 1964, and let's say you have military experience, that military experience was in the Afghan War of the 1980s. That's essentially the people that they're looking for. So, and they've dropped the college education requirement as well. And in certain, at least anecdotal reports, they've been accepting people who don't have a high school education either. So you're getting people who are older, unclear what physical condition that they're in, unclear the level of education as well. And that again suggests, as you put it, mass, but not quality. And the other sort of part of what we've seen in terms of like, where's the Russian military going to get these people? Again, over the last month or so, we've been observing within the Russian media, like the state, official media, they've been talking about the advances and successes of Wagner Private Military Company, which previously the Russian state had been very explicit. It's a private military company. Mercenaries are illegal under Russian law. Whatever these people, Yevgeny Prigozhin and all these various companies, whatever they're doing in Mali or Central African Republic or Syria or wherever, it is outside the Russian state. Obviously, it had been part of like the GRU, Russian military intelligence, for like a long time. But now, because they are trying to get as many bodies to the fight as possible, they are talking about Wagner. So that's, putting more context on what you called, the fancy bookkeeping. Wagner, troops from LNR, DNR, and I've even seen, videos of people saying, Luhansk National People's Republic fighters who are saying, we've already conquered, Luhansk, we've already conquered our region. Why should we fight in other places? And so that suggests, that the total command and control is not as robust as what we might have anticipated. So between Wagner, Ukrainians who are LNR, DNR fighters, as well as people from across like the spectrum, that may be where they're trying to get the numbers. And this is like, we can sort of like move on to a different topic, but when we're thinking about, Putin clearly not engaging in mass mobilization. Mass mobilization would be the admission that the special military operation needs to become a war. Clearly, Putin is trying to avoid having society participate in any meaningful way in this conflict. Obviously, in terms of the information space, making sure people are prosecuted, making sure people are afraid to speak out, all those various things in terms of maintaining support for Putin, maintaining support for the special military operation, but making sure that people don't have to sacrifice anything. That's a clear component. And so when we're thinking about that, we're thinking about, again, I think about, people up to the age of 58. Like, take me, for example. I could be one of these sorts of people in terms of, let's say, I have no prior military experience, but let's say I'm full of piss and vinegar. I'm extremely motivated. I want to take the fight to the bad guys. I'm 40 years old. So we've seen that the people who are going from Third Army Corps in terms of their training are getting somewhere between 3 and 6 weeks of training. As you put it, with 3 to 6 weeks of training, am I a danger to myself and others? Most definitely. Might I learn something in 3 to 6 months of fighting? Also, most definitely. So, assuming I don't get killed or grievously injured, I get to the end of my contract. Am I more likely to, after having been fighting against Ukraine and like NATO grade weapons for the last 6 months, am I more likely to say, yes, please give me another 6 months? Or am I more likely to say, you know what, I did my part, great experience, thanks for the medals, I'm done here. And so that might be not just in terms of a problem of making up the numbers now, but maintaining those numbers, both as casualties increase, but also as people on short-term contracts come to the end of their contracts and think to themselves, I've done my part. I'm ready to go back to my regular life. And I think that, is where we can think about counteroffensive. Ukrainians are getting their stuff. Russians are fighting, their new reserves, their new numbers. But which of those is going to be more sustainable? That's basically the bigger military question that we have going forward.
So I think we've covered that piece pretty extensively. Although I'll make a side comment about where they get the equipment. I do know that recently Russia held its annual military games. I forget what they're actually called, but bring in their partners that they sell all their weapons to and do these demonstrations. So they definitely had some of their newer stuff there. So maybe once they were done with the games, they decided to give it all to the Third Army Corps. Although with those games, this is a sidebar, but as an information piece, I watched some of the footage from those, and it made me wonder what the incentive is for their partner countries to come, because what I saw in those games was a lot of really poor performance by some of these partner countries, like tanks running into each other, going off tracks, missing targets, like not the thing I would want to showcase in these games. So maybe there's some, I don't know if there's some 6-level chess going on in showing how much better the Russians are compared to their buyers, basically. But if nobody walked away from those games really looking great. And anyway, no.
Just not that I need to have the last word, but I'd been reading that the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, his wife owns the exhibition company. So the company that puts on the physical, like the actual games itself, that she's the owner of that. So you're out in the field, Ukrainians keep shooting at you, but at least the defense minister's wife has, her big revenue event of the year.
Yeah, so, which I think is sort of, in a nutshell, that's Putin's Russia, for you right there. The lining the pockets are more important than the military considerations for what that equipment could have done on the battlefield, right? Instead of being in a parade. But
yeah, and like that, we'll move on to like the different topics. But when we then think about, you're in the middle of a special military operation that is entering into month 7, you have a military exhibition, and you're having strategic exercises. You have to have those, because if you cancel those, essentially says to the rest of the world, things are not normal. So you have to carry on as if things were normal, and you sort of have, like the Potemkin village. You have these Potemkin, the things that look nice, but they hide what's the poor things that are happening behind, the display. And it's just incredible having strategic exercises at the same time you're not doing terribly well in a war. keeping up appearances.
Yeah, and there was one last picture I saw. Then we'll move on. But somebody had posted a comparison between the sort of the troop and equipment stuff that was on parade at the previous year's games here compared to this one, and this one was obviously a lot smaller. So, who knows? Maybe in next year's games you'll have like the one remaining tank left in their inventory. We're still hoping that we're not talking about this at that time frame, but it was interesting that picture there. Even in the public thing they're trying to highlight, it's a reflection of the losses they've taken because they just have so many fewer things to put on display there. So, okay, shifting gears now. We want to go into some of the external diplomatic stories that have been happening the last week.
Yeah. So first, the death of Mikhail Gorbachev. There's a lot to be said. We could easily spend an hour just on the impact of that. But one, he's probably the last major leader, maybe John Major, of the UK, of just the world leaders of that generation. They're sort of like they're leaving the scene altogether. In a larger sense, there's a lot that can be said about Gorbachev. The positive things are that he clearly, so like in a certain sense, under his leadership, the Soviet Union came to an end. Under Putin has also been ruling for more than 20 years. And so what Gorbachev and Putin can, just like when you put them side by side, we can think about what is, the secret to Russian political culture and leadership longevity. Is Putin has optimized stability over growth, and Gorbachev took a big gamble on how to get growth and how to get peace. So Gorbachev did not look at war as basically the thing to do in order to demonstrate your prestige. He did not love power. And even though he was responsible for, pretty bloody crackdowns in, Lithuania and Georgia in particular, the guy did not seem to be as deeply fascist as the current leadership in Russia, deeply imperial as the current leadership in Russia. And for that, he didn't try to catalyze a civil war at the during the last days in order to hold on to power. He left power and he didn't try to regain it in any untoward fashion. He did run in a couple elections in the 1990s, but obviously whether people were happy to see the end of the Soviet Union or wanted the Soviet Union to have continued, nobody wanted Gorbachev, and he sort of understood his time had passed. I guess the other thing to say about it is obviously, like, his interpreter had said he was heartbroken by this war, between Russia and Ukraine. Certainly, we are dealing with the consequences of the end of the war, the end of the Soviet Union today in Ukraine, because the issues of this war in Ukraine, like when we boil it down, is how far does Russia's influence project, and how independent can the countries around Russia be today? Are they able to go into the European Union or NATO if they so want? And that sort of question of how far does Russia go? Gorbachev started it, and 30 plus years later, we're still in the middle of it. And so that to me is, the legacy. We're not going to figure this out until basically the relationship between Russia and Ukraine is figured out. So those events of the late 1980s, early 1990s are going to be with us in terms of determining European and international security for another generation. And that, remains to be seen. We also know, I was reading the last headline, is Putin will not attend the funeral of Gorbachev. He said he, went and visited a couple days ago, but that he won't visit the funeral because, quote, his schedule won't allow it. Which is, he did visit, the hospital, but ultimately he could have said a lot nicer things. He could have said, my presence is distracting because of the security issues, because of quarantine issues, etc. But I'll make my visits before and after, with the rest of the family. But he said, my schedule won't allow it. So,
Yeah, well, could that be a? I mean, I having read a little bit about his both his view of Gorbachev and his view of the Soviet Union. Is this like a kind of a last sort of backhanded slap maybe at Gorbachev? Because we know Putin has said in the past he saw the dissolution of the Soviet Union as the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. So is this kind of one final way that he gets to um, show his displeasure with Gorbachev allowing the Soviet Union to fall apart?
Yeah, it's the final petty dig, and because as you suggest, the that quote of Putin where he says the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. In the entire quote, he makes it clear that the reason that is that it marooned millions of Russians abroad. And people who had had a common flag, a common culture, common institutions, all those sorts of things suddenly found themselves in foreign lands without the protection of Russia. And so that when Putin has, in a certain sense, modeled himself as being an anti-Gorbachev, the thing that clearly Putin has hated and criticized about Gorbachev for many years is that Gorbachev fundamentally did not see the point of the Soviet Union as protecting, exalting, and promoting Russians, and that even Yeltsin, who was basically took Russia out of the Soviet Union for the benefit of Russians, that Yeltsin was basically weak. So when you put these critiques together, we can see basically what are the sources of how Putin practices power. Centralized power, so that you are the anti-Yeltsin, so that he's the anti-Yeltsin. And then essentially look at Russia not as a country, but as an empire, as a place to promote, as a place to increase the size. And that basically the low-hanging fruit are all the Russians that are abroad. And that's the core thing that Putin has so long criticized Gorbachev for being weak, is that he basically allowed like the West to not respect the Soviet Union, by basically like giving up, all the satellite countries in Eastern Europe, and that he basically left Russians, quote unquote, helpless abroad. And so much of Russian foreign policy over the past 2 decades has been about finding those Russians, those ethnic Russians, and basically making them live in Russia one way or another. And that, is obviously, again, part of the war that we're observing today. And so Putin, the anti Gorbachev, anti Yeltsin, but trying to make himself a traditional imperial Russian leader. And basically what we can see is the success of that is that he's been in power now into his third decade. The failures of that is he's probably, when he leaves the scene, going to leave Russia. We don't know what condition, but it's certainly not going to be a happy one.
Yeah, so I'm going to try and do a semi clever segue here now, talking about Russians going back into Russia. Another development has been restricting the ability of Russians to leave Russia and go visit other parts of Europe. So it's something that's been sort of percolating beneath the surface, I think, for a few months now. But there was sort of finally a decision, at least by some countries, in terms of restricting Russian visits. So where do we stand on that? What are the restrictions and who's putting them in place?
Yeah, so at this point, the immigration policy, contentious everywhere we go. So what we've seen in basically in the last couple of days is that the European Union, so the European Union is a political union of how many states are in there? I think 29 or 30, something like that. Also within that, there is something called the Schengen zone. And so the Schengen zone is for people who've been to Europe and they pass between, borders without having to show any, identification. The Schengen zone is what allows that passport-free travel, like inside the European Union. So what happened over the last couple of days is that the European Union and the Schengen zone countries uh, made the decision to suspend the visa facilitation, the visa facilities between themselves and Russia, so that all the various categories of frequent travelers to the European Union Schengen zone from Russia now have to basically were suspended, so that they now have to basically provide more information to get these short-term visas. They have to pay more, and that what the European countries are doing is also then limiting the capacity, both in terms of processing and also limiting the numbers of short-term visas that are available to citizens of the Russian Federation. So this is not a visa ban. It's not canceling the visas of Russians who are, in Europe right now, but it is the first step towards breaking the ability of Russians to travel at will to Europe. And various countries within that have basically the prerogative to have further restrictions based on national security exemptions. And so we've seen that Estonia is no longer issuing short-term visas. We've seen that the Finns within the Schengen zone are limiting the total number of like these tourist short-term visas, and basically providing the rest to long-term visas, visas for study, visas for work, things of that nature, in order to basically limit the ability of Russians to come in and out at will. And that seems to be basically the first step towards, the longer this war goes on, basically further narrowing of what Russians can do in Europe. And so that could mean that the next step, prohibiting short-term visas altogether, not allowing renewal of visas, and that would mean basically asking Russians either to go through the process of getting long-term visas to stay or leaving. And again, what in terms of the Russian domestic impact, on one hand, Russian media is talking about this is nuclear war. If they don't allow us to vacation in the Mediterranean, we're really going to go after them with everything we have. It also, and it's not like, European or like Russians were, how many people, really need to leave in a sense. But what it does in terms of the domestic impact is that it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing to Putin that Russians don't have the ability to travel as freely as before. And this was one of the major sort of advances of the Russian Federation after the Soviet Union, that people could get foreign passports, they could leave the country if they had the desire and the means to do so. And what this does is it indicates that's a little bit more difficult, and that more difficulties are coming the longer the special military operation goes on. So even though it, allowing, free movement of peoples, might be bad in a certain like bigger sense, the medium term impact, the short to medium term impact is that it shows what Russians can't do. And that essentially is, grist for the mill in terms of the propaganda, but also it says what else is going to be restricted? What further things are we not going to be able to do going forward? And I don't know that the Russian state has a really good answer for that, at least at the moment.
Yeah, actually, I was going to have a question about that, and if the unknown is the unknown, so be it. But I was just sort of wondering your larger sense of how, certainly embarrassing in the short term, but is this the kind of thing that is going to, obviously the intent is to put pressure on the Russian people to sort of drive a wedge between them and Putin. What's the realistic likelihood that this is going to, finally be the thing that drives that wedge, or does this potentially have an unintended outcome of pulling or letting Putin sort of tighten his grip on the people more, as an example of their sort of shared misery and how the otherness of everything outside of Russia.
So I've been watching a lot of sort of like man on the street type interviews of people. Someone comes up and is like, "There's a visa ban on Russian." They're a little loose with language, but they say, "What do you think of that?" And what was striking to me is how so many people, and this is sort of like the success when we were talking about like the recruitment and force structure issues earlier. A common response was something to the effect of, "I'm not fighting in the special military operation. That has nothing to do with me. Why should I basically be punished for this?" And you could see like that to me was interesting because it said people are, after, the shock of basically like, the first like week or two, you see the missiles, like, you see like the advances of like the Russian military, is that over the last 6 months, people have normalized basically that there's a special military operation going on of course the West is always, opposed to us, but that to a large extent people are able to just tune this out. And this is the sort of thing that can get people's attention, because even if they're not frequently traveling to Europe, they always thought in their minds, past 30 years, we always could. And basically being deprived of something makes Russian people pay more attention to what's happening in Ukraine. And that I personally reckon is going to be far more important than the other stuff that we could talk about, such as like, price cap on like Russian oil and such that we were going to talk about next, or Russia being labeled. And it's sort of in the same vein. There's been a lot of like talk about whether Russia is going to be labeled as a state sponsor of terrorism. Again, these are the sort of things which, what is the impact of it? We can assess like, what are the legal implications or financial implications, but at its core, it's embarrassing. And that to me is one of the things that Putin has done so well in his time in power, is creating a world and creating a political system in which he's not embarrassed and Russia's not embarrassed. That Russia is taken seriously, that he's taken seriously. And starting to add these things up where basically external actors are saying, we physically do not want you. That to me sort of gets under the skin a lot more effectively than, a lot of the other sanctions that have been imposed. And because like sanctions on like oligarchs, some super rich person basically like is not able to access his like yachts. Okay, like that's probably pretty annoying for the oligarch, but that oligarch is extremely wealthy because of his proximity to Putin. As long as he maintains his loyalty to Putin and doesn't, like speak out against the war, he's going to be fine. The Russian state will find some other enrichment opportunity. But some random person suddenly thinking, I'm not going to be able to go to Vienna. I've never been to Vienna. I had no plans, but now it's being taken away from me. That to me is like, that's like a core level issue. And I think that's going to be, as these restrictions get more restrictive over time, I don't know that the Russian state has a good response.
Yeah, I think that to your point of the embarrassment, that's something that authoritarian states often do not have a very good response to. And this gets into things like, you know, what you're allowed to tell jokes about, right? Because humor leading to embarrassment is something that authoritarian regimes can't stand, because that goes directly against their legitimacy,
Mhm.
which I think another sidebar, but that might explain some of the viral success of this online group called the Fellas or NAFO or various things. Which, if you had told me, 8 or 9 months ago that one of the online information domain efforts would be a bunch of people with like these little dog avatars in their profiles you know, doing poop posting to try and embarrass Russian media or information stuff, I'd be like, what do you? This is like 5-year-old stuff, but nevertheless, there they are. And embarrassment and satire and humor undermining someone who doesn't have a good answer can be a very disruptive tool. Um, but enough on the fellas. So unless you
No,
had something,
yeah, no, I think it's important to like dwell on this point because for those who haven't been watching or reading or what have you, so the Shibu Inu or Shiba Inu dog, the basically think a lovely Japanese dog, just something that you look at and think like, oh, that's a lovely Japanese dog. Um, People with those avatars are cyberbullying like Russian state officials on social media, and we generally say like cyberbullying is bad. I think to do it against your adversary in a conflict, but doing it with humor, not like having like gross images or not like swearing at people or not trying to like break, their ability to like physically use the internet, like, in some sort of, sending like viruses or something, but just relentlessly teasing people about their own, basically the Russian state's shortcomings, their inability to fight a war as they please. That has broken to a large extent the Russian ability to influence basically Western audiences in a way that would not have seemed possible a couple years ago. Over the last number of years, we've seen, how many different like studies or, hand wringing about the Russians being able to manipulate Western audiences. The response was make fun of them and make fun of them in ways that they recognize is valid. And that, as you said, authoritarian leaders don't like to be embarrassed. Part of that is that authoritarian leaders and authoritarian states need to project this idea and this image that they are indefinite. Whatever happens, the state remains, the leader remains. And if someone with a dog avatar is making fun of you on the internet, that gets under your skin in a way that sort of like few other things can, because it shows you to be silly and it shows you to be losing your cool. And certainly, like we've seen, like Russian UN officials who had been pumping out like really awful statements, like in recent months, were basically bullied off Twitter, and like in a way that is humorous. So who knows what that'll do in terms of information operations going forward, but certainly worth mentioning.
Yeah, it's a one of the many sort of new dynamics that we're seeing manifested sort of at scale now in this conflict. And it makes me, your same point about leaders and projecting their sort of persona of endurance and invulnerability. It's sort of the same reason why I think it's been reported that Xi Jinping, head of the Communist Party in China, some people have used Winnie the Pooh to sort of do the same thing and embarrass him, and he hates it, does not like it, like is to the point of like removing those images from behind the Great Firewall. So, it's very interesting that basically people with cartoons can punch back and really and get under the skin of incredibly powerful people in such a way. So, nobody wants to see the sort of escalation out in the South China Sea or the Pacific region that we're seeing in Ukraine. But were that to happen, I would sort of fully expect, based on what the fellows have been doing with their dog avatars, we might see a lot more Winnie the Pooh avatars popping up over there as part of the information campaign.
Yeah, and again, for the viewers and listeners who are not familiar with why Winnie the Pooh is banned in China, is that they Xi Jinping and Winnie the Pooh bear a certain resemblance. And there was a picture taken of Xi Jinping walking with Barack Obama. And was it Barack Obama? Was like a tall, thin guy. But Xi Jinping was sort of swinging his arms, and he had his pants hiked up, nearly to his nipples. And just the image looked as Winnie the Pooh as a human could get. Just sort of like just swinging his arms, looking like he's having a fine day. But it shows if the things are, one of the jokes that the now canceled Woody Allen had is things are only as bad as what you can't joke about. And so if you can't joke about your physical resemblance to a cartoon bear, or the fact that little Japanese dogs are bullying you, then it shows those are the things that the authoritarian states really take seriously and need to be taken seriously.
Yeah. And now, thanks to lots of different social media platforms, that just creates more opportunity to use unseriousness to try and undermine those regimes or those leaders. Okay, I think we've hit that piece pretty good there. You had mentioned, so I guess we can transition to the next one, which you sort of mentioned there a few minutes ago, which is the oil price cap. I think this is going to kind of get us into more domestic dynamics going on. So if you want to elaborate on that and what the impact is going to be.
So sure. So obviously the war is volatility. And so what we've seen over the past 6 months of this conflict is that there has been just volatility in the oil price market. Here in the United States, gas prices were really high for a certain period. And what basically Russia's been making a lot of money off basically that price volatility, because they continue to export oil, to Europe, but also India and China, which we'll get back to in a second. So even though the European Union, United States have banned the import of like oil products, coal, things of that nature, the big issue here is oil and natural gas. So in terms of natural gas, several countries, Lithuania, for example, Latvia, have basically already cut off the import of Russian natural gas. And in that, we'll see that basically the European Union has taken this opportunity to basically enact their climate change strategy that they've had for a long time. A lot of the European economy is based on very inexpensive Russian natural gas. The European Union also wants to reduce basically the usage of fossil fuels. So they're taking basically this increase in the price of natural gas in particular to one, reduce consumption, drive greater efficiency, but also diversify the sources of energy, restart debates about the applicability of nuclear energy, and basically increase the usage of renewables. So by the time this war is over, Europe will have done basically more on achieving its climate change agenda than probably in the previous 20 years. So that's one part of this piece. The second is that when we think about oil, what the price cap is going to be is that obviously looking at this oil money is what funds the conflict. So what the United States, its G7 partners, but it's going to expand. What they're going to do is they're going to prohibit or ban the financing and insurance and insurance gets to like the actual shipping of oil that is sold at a price higher than what is set abroad, in Europe and in the United States. And so what this is meant to do is that they're going to identify what is the price of production, what is a permissible amount of profit, and then not allow all of the ancillary services that basically allow that oil to get to the customer. So obviously, Russia then has the ability to export more to, let's say, India, China, two countries which have taken a lot of relatively inexpensive energy because Russia has to ship at a discount, which has been about $20 to $30 a barrel. But really, the sort of the long-term effect of this price cap is that sanctions, in a certain sense, are sticky. And so once basically this very loose system is set in, where the financing and insurance of oil that is priced above a certain level is started to establish, then basically what all the various Western countries are going to do is then observe how does it work in practice? Where are basically the leaks in this? Where are the cracks in this? How can we make it more effective? How can we essentially decrease that price? And that's going to be, in the first couple of weeks, we're going to hear this thing isn't working. We should just like jettison it altogether. But as it gets more restrictive, more countries over time, one, it's going to become more efficient in terms of limiting the amount of money that gets into Russia. But two, once China and India start to observe, or these firms are starting to observe, oh, there's another layer of sanctions involved here, the self-sanctioning, they're trying to figure out how do we basically diversify this bank, this Indian bank, from all of those other banks and all those other shipping companies and insurance companies that are not doing business with Russian oil. And so I think, in terms of what we've seen in terms of the sanctions regime over the last 6 months, getting it in the first place is basically the hardest thing because they always expand over time. And so the price cap now is going to be far more restrictive in 6 months, 12 months, assuming the conflict is still ongoing. And that's going to really shape what Russia's ability to basically make money that it still needs to buy imports from abroad. So this is going to be really destructive to Russia's economy in 6 to 12 months from now.
It goes back into the sort of the eternal question of what cracks first, is the Russian economy or the support keeping Ukraine going on. Again, 6 to 12 months from now, who knows what we're going to be looking at, but something to watch and revisit. You mentioned, I want to circle back on a couple themes here because you mentioned the nuclear energy piece, and we also talked about Gorbachev. So as we know, one of the things Gorbachev was in power for was one of the great nuclear disasters of the 20th century, which was the explosion at the nuclear plant in Chernobyl, which was also in Ukraine, in which, by the way, Russian forces blew through and dug up all the radioactive soil because they didn't have the right maps for where Chernobyl actually was and how dangerous it was. But, part of their learning organizational approach to military operations. This week, there's been renewed attention on another nuclear power plant in Ukraine, I hope I pronounced this somewhat correctly, the Zaporizhzhia power plant, which is, I believe it is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes.
So why has it gotten attention recently? Well, it's because there's been a lot of military activity. When I say activity, things blowing up in very close proximity to the nuclear power plant. There's been a lot of imagery showing that Russia has basically staged forces right next to it. So using the power plant sort of as an apocalyptic shield for their forces there. But as of yesterday, actually, after a lot of attempts to get third-party inspectors in, there was a team from the International Atomic Energy Agency under the UN to finally, sort of take a look at the security of the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, and what the conditions were there, and what if anything can be done to sort of secure that in the midst of a war zone. So what are some of the larger things we've been seeing, the concerns about the activity around this plant? What are some of the things the IAEA has said that they found in their time there? And I guess the larger question is, what can be done about this, absent Russia essentially leaving it, which they seem unlikely to do.
Right. So, video earlier this morning, where one of the IAEA inspectors like pointed to a rocket shell that was in the ground that indicated it was coming from some point east, and the Russian civilian official was explaining that when rockets hit the ground, they turn directions. So this was actually, and he made because he was speaking. So why the Russians, for to an international group, didn't find at least one person who could speak English. But he's explaining in Russian to people who don't speak Russian, with like the interpreters or like vaguely nearby. Basically, the shell comes in, but when it hits the ground, because of the impact, it changes direction. So actually, it came from the opposite direction of what your eyes would suggest you're observing. So we can see that what the Russians are doing at this point is they're using the nuclear power plant as a shield for offensive operations in the area. And like the outer buildings are being damaged. We know that basically the Russians are preparing to connect this nuclear power plant to the Crimean electricity grid. So, which is a good sign because it shows that they prefer to steal the energy rather than like spreading radiation into the world, across Europe into the world. And this to me is like, obviously everything is insane. Like everything we're talking about is insane, like on a certain level. But the key thing that Russia's been trying to get Europe to do is to think that Ukraine is more trouble than it's worth. And the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova said that in response to the visa bans and all that sort of stuff, is that something that doesn't need a passport to cross borders is radiation. So what the Russians are saying is, if we can't find any way for you to like us more than Ukraine, then you, with radiation fallout, if you continue your support for Ukraine. That's basically what's the issue here, is that the Russians are threatening nuclear fallout. Basically, the status quo continues. So, like, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, but to the insanity part of this, for I how do I put this? For a threat to be credible, it has to be credible, right? I guess whether you want to hazard a bet on this or not is it's a frightening question. But as I understand it, if this threat were to be credible and they were to allow something to happen to the reactor, um, the prevailing environmental conditions right now, as I've been reading them, would actually push some of that radiation right back on them, in terms of prevailing winds at this time of year. If the winds don't change or not, but they have once you let it out, you can't control where it goes. So is this a credible threat in any shape or form, or are we at the point of past insanity where they may not care? They might do it and be damned, if you will.
That nuclear issues are taken more seriously, and that again, if the Kherson counteroffensive is successful, which provides then, like a new tranche of weaponry that threatens not just Russian forces in Zaporizhzhia, but also like if you get to Zaporizhzhia, then Crimea is under threat. Stuff that, Donetsk and Luhansk, they can be under threat, etc. What's Putin's definition of like his own personal apocalypse? Russian forces being defeated in the field in Ukraine, or quite literal nuclear fallout, on Russian forces plus like the rest of Europe. We know that like in terms of nuclear issues in this conflict, like Putin directly like threatened, the United States, do not participate directly in this conflict, otherwise like we'll go nuclear. And so like Russia hasn't attacked any of the basically NATO supplies coming in, but also like the United States has not entered the fight directly. European states have not entered the fight directly. So we know that Putin at that level is taking nuclear weapons very seriously. About this is, and again, personality into like the Russian military and political leadership might be a fool's errand, but if there is some nuclear issue due to Russians, it makes every other political discussion that we've had very different. Because, when we think about visa suspensions, causes a nuclear incident, visa bans are going to be the next day. We know that the discussion about whether to label the Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, which basically then would mean anyone who does business with any component of like the Russian economy would get sanctioned to the hilt. That conversation becomes a lot easier. Russia has been appealing to basically like anti-Western sentiment across the world, and including, our sometimes dear friends, the Indians. So how would the rest of the world react if Russia is doing something that basically the rest of the world has agreed over the last 75 or so years is a bad thing? So in that sense, and what would be, finally speaking, what would be the increase in military support to Ukraine if basically people are thinking, if we don't stop Russia, what's the next nuclear thing that they're going to do? So I think what Russia's trying to do is basically just empower anti-Ukraine, pro-Western or pro-Russian voices within the European sort of political elites to again get to the let's reduce the support to Ukraine, because the alternative is, we have some sort of nuclear situation. If we get that real nuclear situation, so many different things can happen, all of them bad. And so perhaps that might be like the last sort of like, shred of rationality that I'm holding on to in terms of maintaining the basic sanctity of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant.
We would definitely like to think that there is even the like crazed person won't cross, But on the flip side, as you just said, there's ordnance still exploding in close proximity to the plant, right? So your intentions might be to not cross that line, but if you're also not really constraining your troops from launching ordnance into that area, I don't know, how seriously do you really take it? Because they're not good shots, right? Their approach to firepower is indiscriminate saturation, not really the TTP you want to use near a nuclear power plant.
And that to me, like that's the real fear, is that fearlessness based every day, and things can go in a bad if it wasn't it.
I think that's the randomness and the contingency of once you again, sort of when Putin started this whole war, right? Like once you roll the iron dice, you don't really know how it's going to go. Once you start putting troops and ordnance near a can have massive regional negative impacts. You don't know at that point. You've rolled the dice. You really have. All right. Just a couple minutes left. I do want to try and get to one last thing in this very newsy week, but 2 days ago, it's been a little while since a Russian, oligarch economic leader has accidentally, fallen out of a high-story building. But we just had one a couple days ago, and it was the head of, again, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, but the Lukoil, petroleum company in Russia. I think what I read was he was suffering from a very serious illness, which is why he was in the hospital. And then somehow he wound up on the ground outside of the hospital from his window. So if you could maybe, in just a minute or two here, who was this person? What was the company that he was working on, and what might explain his sudden unfortunate defenestration?
The board chair of the board of directors of Lukoil, which is one of Russia's largest private oil company, which obviously lost its market capitalization once it was delisted. There's been a lot of people in the oil and gas industries that have fallen out of windows in recent months. So the fact that it keeps happening to very wealthy people, and again, Russian windows are not like weird. Like, stood by windows, I've thought, I do not want to go outside this window. I do not want to jump out this window. I love life. Really senior people in like really big companies keep falling out of them. Suggests to me, and this is like a wild speculation, is that given the fact that oil and gas companies are the last major companies to earn a lot of money, that when you kill the senior executives, you are basically cutting out competitors for those revenue streams. And that this suggests that there's a consolidation of revenue streams and basically rerouting them to, other aspects of the economy or other wealthy people. And so I think this is, if we think more about the mafia, but we overlay it onto like the big sources of money are not casinos, but oil and gas.
Like I said, it has been a while. And we had the car bomb go off. So I guess we're back to sort of the normal way of doing things for dealing with some of those folks, which is the windows and their lack of safety features. On an hour here, and I'm semi impressed with the two of us because we can often go on for 60 minutes on one topic, and we got through pretty much all the big developments from the last week. So it's good to do this catch up, and all of these trends are things we're going to be watching here in the coming weeks as well. I think the Kherson offensive or counteroffensive is definitely going to take a lot of attention, although, as we noted, not a lot of information coming out about it, but we will start to see probably the results here in the coming weeks. So something to look at. And hopefully we're not talking about the power plant again in a couple of weeks, but we'll see. Thanks again for your time. Happy birthday to your father. Hope he watches this, listens to it, and that y'all have a good long weekend. And thanks to our audience for tuning in again here. We'll be coming back. We are going into a long weekend, so maybe another week or two before we get back to this, but we will keep going and watching these trends. And if something unforeseen comes up, we'll try and get to it as soon as we can. But all right, Yuval, and thank you very much. Have a good weekend.
Happy trails.
See you later.